Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on our second Ask a Washington Beekeeper session. My name is Megan Bryant. I'm a board member with the Washington State Beekeepers Association. I will be one of the moderators for today's session. Just wanted to touch on a couple etiquette things. If you guys would post your questions in the chat, we will answer them as we can and as many as we can here live. And any of them that we can't get to, we will make sure that there are answers there in the chat. With that, the presentation's got a lot of information in it, so we're going to hold off on asking and answering questions until the end of the presentation. Just wanted to say thank you guys for coming. This is our second session, so we do these once a month. However, we will be taking a break in December with all of the holidays, and we will be back in January with some exciting topics. Ask a Washington Beekeeper is sponsored by the Washington State Beekeepers Association and Washington Farmers Veteran Coalition. Our goal in hosting these sessions is to reach out to beekeepers that maybe don't have access to a local beekeeping club, or really anybody that has beekeeping questions or just wants to learn more about bees and beekeeping. The Washington State Beekeepers Association does have several resources on our website, and we'll put that in the chat for you guys. If you're interested in starting a club or maybe seeing if there is a club nearby that you don't know about, feel free to go over to the website. There's a lot of resources there. All of our sessions are being recorded and will be on the Ask Washington Beekeeper Facebook page. So you guys can watch this anytime, watch any of our previous ones. We are also looking at posting those onto YouTube, so stay tuned for that. With Veterans Day being just last week, I do want to take a time to recognize all of our veterans and thank them for their service to our country. And today's topic is about fat bodies and honeybee lifespan, and that's being presented by Dawn Beck. So with that, I will pass it over to Dawn.
Hi, thank you, Megan. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yep.
Good. Thank you, everyone who's out there. Thank you for coming, and thank you to WASVA for putting these on. It's a great way to reach out to all the beekeepers. We have a lot of information today, and I'm really excited to share this presentation with you. Feel free to stick around afterwards, like Megan said, if you have any questions, but this presentation itself will take just about the full hour. So jumping in, you've probably heard of fat bees. I first learned about bee fat bodies when Sammy Ramsey's team discovered the varroa mite feed mainly on the bee's fat body. And I immediately wanted to know, what is the fat body and what are the effects the varroa are having on the bee when they're feeding on the bee's fat body? Is that damage permanent? Is there a way to protect the bees from this organ damage? And there didn't seem to be a lot of readily available information out there for beekeepers. There was some in the professional literature, but it was scattered amongst a lot of papers. And at the end, I can actually post my research papers out if you guys want to go in and take a deeper dive and look at this yourselves. So I'm currently taking the Cornell Master Beekeeping course, and they required me to do a research presentation for part of the final exams. And it was only supposed to be 15 minutes, but I liked this topic so much that I built it out into a full hour presentation. So today we're going to look at what the fat body is, what it's used for, and most importantly, how it affects the lifespan of individual bees and the entire colony. And we're also going to learn about the causes and consequences for the bees of having damaged fat bodies. Let's see. Got to get this first slide to move. Hang on. There we go. So a little bit about me. My name is Dawn Beck. I am currently a master beekeeper through the University of Montana, and as I said, I'm working on my Cornell University master beekeeper certificate. I'm in my 8th year of beekeeping, and last year I managed about 40 colonies. I live in the Skagit Valley, which is about an hour south of the Canadian border. And I really enjoy learning and teaching about bees and serving on lots of different bee clubs and boards. So, what is a fat body? The fat body is a nutrient-rich vital organ near the surface of the abdomen, and it's found in both adult and developing honeybees. The name fat body is a bit of a misnomer. It's not primarily for making or storing fat. It's actually an organ that evolved to store and process proteins, the proteins that are found in pollen. And we'll see how the fat body is used in bees, how it evolved, and how essential it is to colony health. And we're also going to learn about how it grows in bees and how it affects the rate at which they age. And that the rate at which they age, if it changes, is called plasticity in aging. And lastly, we're going to see how fat bodies help the bees get through winter and the devastating effects that poor nutrition and varroa have on this organ. So let's take a closer look at the fat body itself. I don't know if my cursor shows up here, but right now I'm pointing to these red dots on the bee's abdomen. And these are the fat bodies, and they run the full length of the abdomen. It's just above where the wax comes out, the wax mirrors on the bee's belly. It's kind of a globular organ that changes in size throughout the bee's life. And under a microscope, they look a little bit like blobs of fat. The fat body is incredibly important to both the bee and the whole colony. In insect terms, it functions like a combination of the human liver and human fat cells. The liver-like function provides immunity, and it filters out toxins. The fat cell function stores readily available food for the entire colony, but the storage is mostly in the form of proteins instead of fats. And the fat body is an energy powerhouse for bees. Its primary job is to process the proteins in pollen into a jelly-like food for the colony called vitellogenin. And vitellogenin is literally the lifeblood of the colony. It's the fuel, it's the building blocks of what all the bees run on. Honey is kind of their gasoline and their fuel. The vitellogenin is the protein that they make their body from, that they grow and they mature and they use. So what is vitellogenin used for? The proteins are transported from the fat body up to the glands in two locations. One set is up in the head, which is illustrated here in blue, and the other set of glands are in the mandibles, which are illustrated in yellow. The glands in the head are called the hypopharyngeal glands, which we often hear about in conjunction with feeding the brood. And the mandible glands is actually where the vitellogenin brood food comes out. And we often hear about the mandible glands in relation to feeding the queen. So let's talk about how the fat body develops. While the bee is in the larval state, the fat body fills most of the larva. It's kind of a gooey protein soup. And the larva is fed copious amounts of vitellogenin by the nurse bees. When the cell is capped over, the larva's fat body at that point has to contain all the nutrients that the bee will need to develop into adulthood, because once it's capped, it's not fed again until it emerges. And as the capped pupa develops, the organs take shape and the adult bee emerges with the fat body only in her abdomen. As she matures into a nurse bee over the first week of her life, her fat body will grow big and be able to store large amounts of vitellogenin. And this may not seem like much in a single bee, but when you multiply it by the number of nurse bees in a colony, it becomes a huge storehouse of food storage and manufacturing. And it's really an ingenious way to make large stores of food available within the nurse bees. This is a really important concept in colony health. The communal fat glands of all the nurse bees in the colony are an essential resource. As we will see, it's the colony's immunity, its hormones, its food pantry all in one. And when conditions damage the nurse bee's fat bodies, the entire colony is compromised in ways that often can't be seen until it's too late. So while we can weigh hives for honey and kind of look at the frames for pollen stores, the health of the nurse bee's fat body and the amount of the essential vitellogenin that they store is an invisible key to colony survival. So what are the different types of proteins that the bees make in their fat bodies? Vitellogenin is the starting point, and it's the primary ingredient in all nurse bee food. It's synthesized in the fat body, and it's made mainly of protein with some fats and sugars. So when you hear the term fat body, think of it as a protein provider for the colony. Royal jelly is made in the mandibular glands, and vitellogenin is the main nutrient. Royal jelly is mostly water, and it has proteins, simple sugars, some fat, some vitamins and minerals and enzymes. Since the queen doesn't normally take any other food and water on her own, the royal jelly that she's fed provides a complete nutrition for her, even to the water. But the protein-rich brood food is made primarily from vitellogenin, and when it's transferred up into the hypopharyngeal gland in the nurse bee's head. And brood food is a combination of vitellogenin, a little bit of royal jelly, and varying amounts of pollen depending on how old the larva is. They start out with all royal jelly. Remember those first 3 days, all bees are fed 100% royal jelly. And then on the 4th day, they start getting a little bit of pollen, which then causes them to be a worker bee instead of a queen. As that larva ages, it gets increasing amounts of bee bread mixed in with their vitellogenin that helps them to grow faster and stronger. In these pictures, you can see the bees feeding the queen and the brood. And it kind of shows how having that food dispense out near the mandible glands helps when feeding the queen through trophallaxis, and it helps them to be able to reach deep into a cell and feed the larva. So on the bees, what does a fat body do? It's largely a form of storage. It can store a lot of vitellogenin. And when it's in a lot of bees, it becomes the colony's communal food pantry. The total amount of food a colony can process and store becomes essential to the bee's survival in the winter during times of pollen dearth. And the bee bread, while it's stored in the cells as a stored form of pollen, isn't the way that bees actually eat their protein. The nurse bees eat the bee bread, and they use that bee bread to make vitellogenin, and then that is how the pollen and the protein gets out to the other bees. They don't eat the protein, they don't eat the bee bread as much themselves. It's the nurse bees that are the primary processors, making that pollen into something that is usable by the entire colony. The fat body processes the proteins into pollen, into vitellogenin, which is essential to feeding. Every bee in the colony relies on the nurse bees for protein. If their fat bodies are damaged, it takes more bees to feed the colony, which makes fewer bees available to forage. This slows down the colony's growth and its ability to function well. And we'll see later how when varroa damage the fat body and deplete the stores, it increases colony losses in winter. It also, the fat body is helpful for detoxification. Similar to our livers, the fat body filters out pesticides and other toxins. And bees that have compromised fat bodies are more likely to succumb to low levels of pesticides. The fat body regulates hormones and pheromones, which regulate both the physical and social responses within the colony. Hormones are a chemical signal within the bee, and pheromones are chemical signals between bees. And a little further on, we're going to see how hormones and pheromones control the rate at which bees age within the colony. Fat bodies help with immune function. They produce antimicrobials that are the bee's first line of defense against things like deformed wing virus. The vitellogenin also contains little fragments of virus from the nurse bees that prime the immune system of the newly emerged bees. By storing this fragments of virus in their fat bodies, the bees strengthen the immunity of the entire colony to better resist oxidative stress, and it dramatically slows the rate at which they age. The fat body also increases immunity by producing that thin layer of wax on the bee's body that helps it to stay hydrated and keeps out pathogens. And with temperature control, when bees manage the temperature within the colony, it's called thermal regulation. The fat body both insulates the bees and produces hormones that let the bee know if it's too hot or cold. This regulation is what stimulates the bees to fan their wings to help cool off the hive in summer, or to generate heat in the winter to warm the colony. Bees that have damaged fat bodies are unaware that the colony is becoming too cold, and this can contribute to winter losses. I'm going to paraphrase Randy Oliver when he says, bees have made vitellogenin important in both their physiology and behavior. They use it as a food storage reservoir in their bodies, and they use it to synthesize royal jelly. It's an immune system component and is like a fountain of youth to prolong the queen and the forager lifespans. Lastly, it functions as a hormone that affects aging and future foraging behavior. So I hope this slide shows up okay on your screen. If you can't quite see the words, if it's too small, we're mostly going by the pictures. And so we're going to go kind of sequentially through this little picture path. So let's take a closer look at how vitellogenin from the fat body helps to confer immunity within a colony. So starting off, the forager goes out into the big world in search of pollen and nectar. And as she lands on different flowers, she picks up different microbes along with the pollen. The forager then brings this back to the hive, and the middle-aged hive bees pack it into cells with a little bit of honey and some enzymes, and they make what's called bee bread, which is the form of pollen that the nurse bees can digest. The enzymes kind of help break it down a little bit more and make it more nutritionally available. So the microbes are in the bee bread, which the nurse bees then eat. And as they process that bee bread into vitellogenin, their immune system breaks the microbes into small, harmless pieces, which is then fed to the queen and the brood. And when the queen makes her eggs, her vitellogenin with those pathogen fragments is included, sort of like an in-egg vaccination. This is how they are inoculating the queens against American foul brood. They put some killed virus in there with a group of nurse bees who then eat and process that into vitellogenin, and they feed it to the queen. And the queen then has that killed virus in her and then can confer that onto the eggs that she lays. So vitellogenin is used in two ways to prime the young bees against diseases, both through eggs from the queen and through brood food from the nurse bees. As individuals, bees have the lowest immunity of any animal. They are just, as an individual animal, they have very little immunity on their own. They don't have antibodies and things like that humans have. Their immunity primarily comes from social activities like feeding and grooming, passing around the killed virus, so they acquire immunity that way, and the grooming off of pathogens. So let's take a look at where vitellogenin comes from. All animals have vitellogenin. In other animals, it's called an egg yolk protein precursor, which is a very long word, egg yolk protein precursor. And it's basically the essential building blocks of egg yolks. Most animals reproduce by each individual female producing eggs using the vitellogenin from her own body. But worker bees, in normal circumstances, don't lay eggs. Bees are one of the few animals to have cooperative brood rearing, where normally only the queen lays eggs. So since the workers don't make eggs, this means they have a lot of excess vitellogenin that's not being used. So they evolved to use this to feed the brood from the entire colony. So why would a worker care for the queen's offspring and not her own? A worker on her own can lay only a few eggs a day. So she'd be able to do somewhere between 2 and 5 daughter eggs every day. But a queen can average between 1 and 2,000 eggs per day. So even if she mates with a lot of drones, she can still lay far more of that specific bee's genetics than the bee would be able to lay on her own. So I love this picture. This is, I believe, a picture of pollen on bee hairs, and it's just such a beautiful picture, the little bee hairs and the pollen. So let's take a closer look at the pollen. As we've seen, pollen is the protein source that bees use to make their vitellogenin. And the point that every beekeeper needs to understand is that the real nutrition for the colony comes from pollen, specifically a mixture of many plant pollens gathered in nature by foragers. A broad variety of pollen helps to ensure that bees are getting all of the 10 amino acids that are essential to their health. There's an exercise that you can go through that looks at the amount of protein in different flowers and the amount of pollen that those different flowers make to figure out which flowers are the most nutritious. And it turns out that it varies so much from year to year and season to season that it's really impossible to say these are the best pollen producing plants for your area, because there's so, like everything else, there's so many variables in there. So your best bet is just to make sure that your bees are exposed to a wide variety of different pollen bearing plants. Honeybees require a lot of pollen to the tune of 30 to 100 pounds a year in a colony. Imagine what 100 pounds of pollen looks like. It's like 2 of those huge boxes from Man Lake. And imagine what it takes to bring that into the colony, 1 pollen basket at a time. It's a huge undertaking. And the stimulus that compels the foragers to bring all that pollen in is largely the presence of brood pheromone, which is produced by young larvae. Therefore, beekeepers who see pollen loads coming in at the entrance generally assume that the colony is queen right and brood is present. So remember that pheromones are the chemical communication between bees that can trigger hormones that can create physiological changes within the bees. So the pheromones that are floating around the hive are picked up by individual bees, and it triggers changes in the bees based on what is needed in the colony. It's just the whole pheromone hormone dance from bees is just really, really, really interesting and complex. So to the nurse bees, the brood pheromone probably feels a little bit like a nursery full of crying babies. The brood pheromone triggers a hormone release in the nurse bees, compelling them to feed the brood vitellogenin stores from their own bodies. So during the brood up period, the level of brood pheromone in a colony increases, signaling the nurses to feed more and the foragers to focus on pollen gathering. So now that we've looked at the fat body and the benefits of vitellogenin, let's look at the levels of vitellogenin how the levels of vitellogenin can change the rate at which a bee ages. Most animals of a species all age at similar rates. The honeybee, however, has what's called plasticity in aging. And this is the ability to either speed up or slow down aging, which allows a colony a lot of flexibility during times of growth and contraction. And it helps them to moderate the size of their population in response to changing seasons and the availability of resources. Their fat body is what makes honeybees different than most animals. The size of that fat body and how well it's functioning dictates the nutrition and immunity that's available to that bee and the entire colony, and it has an effect on the lifespan of the bees and the colony. Simply put, the larger the fat body is, allows the bee to live longer. And when the bee's fat body and all of its vitellogenin is used up, then the bee dies. Within the hive, the bees strive to maintain a delicate balance of nurse bees and foragers. They need the right amount of foragers to bring in food as the amount of brood in the colony cycles up and down through the year. They also need the right number of nurse bees with large fat bodies to feed that brood. When hive conditions change, requiring a different balance of bees, to a certain extent, the colony can speed up or slow down aging. And sometimes older bees can revert to earlier stages of development. It's all a really delicate and precise dance of pheromone messages within the colony and hormone responses that they elicit within the bees. Let's look at some experiments that have been done with middle-aged hive bees as an example. They're the ones that are no longer doing nursing duties, but are not yet out foraging. So they're kind of in that middle age zone within the hive. In one experiment, all of the foragers were removed from a test colony. As the forager pheromones went down, the call for food went up because there was not enough to feed the brood. This caused the middle-aged bees to mature into foragers faster. And in another case, a large amount of foragers were added to a test colony, causing the forager pheromone to go up. This resulted in the middle-aged bees maturing more slowly since more foragers weren't needed. And in a third experiment, all of the nurse bees were removed. And since there were fewer nurses to feed the brood, the hunger pheromone from the brood increased. And it was found that some of the early foragers were actually able to come back into the hive and revert into being nurse bees. And as beekeepers, we sometimes change the balance of bees within a colony. So there can be outside forces besides just colony expansion and contraction. So for example, when we get a package of bees, it's a random group of bees of many ages, although it's actually oftentimes more nurse bees, because when they're taking those boxes of bees and they're shaking them out to get the bees into a package, oftentimes it's the foragers that fly off and the nurse bees that wind up in a package. So packages are often have lots and lots of nurse bees in them, which is why it's really important to feed them lots of nectar or syrup and pollen in those first few weeks while they're accelerating the speed of aging of some of those nurse bees so they can get those foragers up and running. We also sometimes unbalance colonies when we do splits or move resources between colonies. So when we grab frames of brood and move them between colonies and their associated nurse bees, we momentarily unbalance the colony. But because the bees are able to accelerate or slow reversing, they're able to quickly regain their balance with the existing bees. Randy Oliver says this is why you can raise queens with young foragers if they're given a few days to revert. Now, they'll never be quite as efficient as if they had been nurse bees all along. They're not quite reverting. They don't make quite as much vitellogenin, but in a pinch, it gets the bees through that spot until they can get more of the nurses to mature to foragers. So let's look at how honeybees age. For the most part, we're going to be focusing on nurse bees, but it's important to see the entire lifespan of the bees so we can understand how that aging process works. So on these slides, this little red dot here is going to be the relative size of the bee's fat body. And then there's a description down here. In this case, it shows that the fat body is small and developing. So in days 1 through 3, the new bee emerges with a really small, not yet fully developed fat body. And the nurse bees feed her a nutritious, protein-rich brood food so that she can start growing. And she eats a little bit within the first several hours. And then by day 3, she's really packing it in and eating a lot. And at that point, then she begins to seek out the stored bee bread and honey in nearby cells to help build up the size of her fat belly and the vitellogenin. This is why the bees tend to put the pollen and the honey right near the brood nest so that those brand new nurse bees don't have to go wandering all around the colony trying to find food. It's just right there where they need it so they can get those fat bodies up and running as quickly as possible. Newly emerged bees are fed by older bees, and they don't yet feed anyone else in the colony. Now, the nurse bee stage is between days 3 and 12, and it's a really important stage for the individual bee and for the whole colony. Around the 5th day, their fat body is fully developed, and they begin nursing duties. The entire colony depends on the food they provide, and the health of the nurse bees directly affects the longevity of the whole colony. The fat body is at the largest it will be for the bee's lifespan, and at that point, it is a powerhouse of synthesizing pollen into vitellogenin. Her needs for protein is at the highest point of her life, and she consumes large amounts of bee bread for feeding brood and to fatten up for if she becomes a winter bee. And we'll talk about winter bees a little bit later. So now we're into the bees that are not nurse bees. So this is just so we can track how the fat body changes as the bee ages. So interestingly, if the bee's fat body stayed large and full, like it was in the nurse bees, their aging would be slowed to a rate that's similar to the queen. A worker bee could actually live for a couple of years instead of a couple of months if they were able to retain that fat body and not feed that out to the rest of the brood. So when they're feeding the brood and feeding the colony, they're sacrificing their longevity for the good of the colony. I'm just always so amazed by almost like the nobility of bees, how everything is about their colony. So the bees that are about 12 to 20 days old are the bees that process honey and make the bee bread. And their fat bodies at that point begin to atrophy. They've fed out a lot of vitellogenin in nursing duties, and that fat body then begins to atrophy. At the same time, their wax glands are now mature, and they begin to build comb. Wax production comes primarily from honey consumption, so the bees' need for vitellogenin drops off rapidly, and their fat bodies begin to shrink as they stop nursing. When they need protein, however, they can still eat bee bread and provide enough protein for their own body needs because their fat body still has enough function to it to support themselves. At around 3 weeks old, the bees are considered older house bees, and they work on building up the strength in their wings to cool the hive or to cure honey. And these are the bees that act as undertaker bees or guard bees, and they're also the ones that are doing those figure-8 orientations outside of the colony. They eat mainly honey and bee bread, but at this point they do start receiving some brood food from the nurse bees since their fat bodies are continuing to shrink and they can't manufacture as much anymore, and they begin to rely on the nurse bees for their protein needs. The final stage of life is foraging, and it lasts about 3 to 6 weeks. And foragers have very small fat bodies, and they have a distinct pheromone from nurse bees. Similar to guard bees, they eat mainly honey and a small amount of bee bread, but they need additional brood food from the nurse bees since their fat bodies are almost all used up. So while it seems like they could feed themselves since they're out foraging on pollen and nectar all day, they really do have to have those nurse bees with their fat bodies, making that pollen into a digestible vitellogenin that they're able to use. And without that, they lose a lot of their immunity. So remember, these are the bees that are out encountering all of these pathogens as they're out there. So they need to have lots of brood food from the nurse bees to help keep their immunity up. Foraging requires a lot of energy, and they do get most of it from nectar, but it takes an incredible amount of energy for a bee to fly. So if you think about a bee's wingspan in comparison to its body, the wings are so long that they have to fold in half at the elbow. But when you think about bees, they have little short wings and round bodies, and they carry heavy loads of food back to the colony. It's a really intensive type of work that takes a lot of energy. Once outside the hive, the foragers age rapidly by using up the last of their vitellogenin stores. They literally use up every drop of protein in their fat bodies, which has become so small that they can't make any more. And they forage until their fat body is completely depleted, and then they die in the field. And in doing so, all of the communal stored vitellogenin is used in service to the colony. None of it is lost out in the field with the foragers when they die. And it's sad, but it's a really, really efficient use of colony resources. So let's look at fat bees. And this fat bees are really, really interesting. I always wondered what makes a winter bee. Well, this is where we get to find out. Fat bees are also called dutinous bees or winter bees. Now, dutinous is one of those $5 words, but it basically means long lasting. They are physiologically different than summer bees and are often considered to be a fourth class of bee. So there are queens, drones, summer workers, and winter bees. Unlike normal foragers, winter bees do not age through tasks, but they have the ability to do any task needed in the colony at any time. They're very, very flexible. This makes sure that the colony functions well in the winter, even as some of the bees are dying off. And the winter bees are made primarily in September and a little bit in October in our area of the country. Mostly in September, though. When you start seeing that brood nest contracting, then you know that the bees that are in the nest at that point a lot of those are your winter bees. They are an adaptive response to cold winters. So there are no winter bees in southern states where it stays warm all year. And it also depends on the race of the bees. Bees with Italian genetics believe in internal summer and are more prone to brooding up all winter rather than making winter bees. So they prefer to combat winter by just continuing to brood up all winter long, and they don't worry quite as much about making bees that live longer. Carniolan type bees moderate the size of their brood nest seasonally and are more likely to make winter bees. So put simply, winter bees are the long-lived bees that keep the colony going until spring. They can do this without the benefit of being able to go out and forage, and they have to live the entire winter off of the communal pantry. Summer bees only live about 4 to 8 weeks, and half of that time is spent as house bees. The remainder is spent outside foraging. But bees in the winter have to live from September to March, a full 6 months. And these bees are a bridge generation that stays in the colony during the cold months and have to live long enough to become the nurse bees and the foragers for that first generation of bees in the spring. So what makes a winter bee? Winter bees begin life exactly like summer bees. They are not made from a special egg or from a different kind of food. There are 2 things that make a winter bee. The first condition is not being exposed to high levels of brood pheromone. This prevents the triggering of that feeding hormone. So the bees don't become nurses and feed out all of their vitellogenin stores. And so their fat bodies stay large and they don't go through that aging process. And the second condition is never having fed brood. And as we saw, once a bee becomes a nurse bee, they are hormonally programmed to feed the colony. So their fat bodies get smaller and they age through colony tasks. If no feeding is required, then their fat bodies stay large and they have extended lives. And I didn't find anything specifically on this, but I think it's probably possible for bees to have done a little bit of nursing. It's not like a one-way street. I think they can do a little bit of feeding of brood and not and still be able to become winter bees, just like some of the foragers can sometimes revert to nursing. But ideally, the longest lived bees are the ones that haven't been exposed to brood pheromone and haven't engaged in extensive nursing of brood. So let's look at the different aging paths that bees can go on, these kind of plasticity and aging, different ways they age, all on one page. So the y-axis, upright on the left, shows how much longer a bee has to live. So when they're workers, they have, weeks to months. And when they're foragers, they sometimes only have days left to go. So it shows how much longer the bee has left in its lifespan. These green lightning bolts are the rate at which they can make vitellogenin. They either make a little or a lot, but the size of the lightning bolt indicates that. The red arrows indicate transfers of vitellogenin. They're either receiving food or they are feeding it out. And the size of the arrow indicates if it's a little bit of food or a lot of food. And then these red dots on their bellies indicate the size of their fat bodies and how much vitellogenin they have stored and are able to feed to others. Let's see. So the first, let's look at a normal path of aging. The bee starts out really young, and remember, she's fed by nurse bees during those first few days while her fat body is developing. She's not making a whole lot of vitellogenin at that point. And then she becomes a nurse bee, and her fat body is large and mature, and she begins feeding all of the other bees in the hive, both the brood and the queen, and any bee that is older, any bee that is not itself a nurse bee is fed by the nurse bees, and they make a lot of vitellogenin. And then as they get older and nursing, their fat body, as they feed out more and more, their fat body begins to get smaller. And at that point, they are hormonally triggered then to become foragers. There's something called the juvenile hormone within the bees that then goes up and causes them to start aging into a forager. And at that point, they do not make a lot of vitellogenin. They have relatively small fat bodies, and most of their vitellogenin is coming from the nurse bees within the hive until they completely run out at the end of their lives. And the first alternate path of aging that bees can do is, instead of going through the normal aging, if it's autumn and there's a low level of brood within the colony, then they can become winter bees. Now, this is not my chart, and I actually think that this blue line here is in the wrong spot, and maybe sometime I'll try and go in Photoshop and change it. But I think this blue line, actually, from what we know, needs to go to this very first bee, because as we know, in order to become a winter bee, they should not have done a lot of nursing. So if they have not done a lot of nursing, then they would go from being a young bee to a mature nurse bee who doesn't have to do any, feeding. And I scooted ahead there, sorry. And so then they would become a winter bee. At the end of winter, they would then continue on their path, becoming a nurse bee and a forager for that first generation. And then a second alternate path of aging that bees can do is, remember those experiments of bees where all of the foragers were taken out of the hive? At that point, the early foragers can actually revert back and become nurse bees. They won't, again, you see this fat belly is a little bit smaller. It's not the full size of a nurse bee, but they can do some nursing duties. So that's kind of the plasticity, all these different ways that bees can age that are so flexible. Let's see. So now let's take a look at things that damage the fat body, how we can protect our bees. We've learned about how important the fat body is and how it is used to change the rate at which the bees age and all of the different functions that it has within the hive. So we want to learn how to protect that fat body within the bees. By far, the largest threat to bees is the varroa mite. There are statistics that say that 80% of colony losses are directly attributable to the effects of varroa predation. So let's look at how varroa compromise the essential nurse bee stage of development. In the larval stage, the creamy inside of the larva is like a mush of organs that doesn't take shape until the bee is capped. And this is why it's really easy for the varroa to feed on that fat body area, because it's kind of all over the entire larva. It basically gets a nutritious soup that the bee would have used to form its fat body. And what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the effect of the varroa has on summer bees, and we're going to look at the effect that varroa has on winter bees. When the bee is compromised during development, its growth is stunted. And this is a permanent effect that makes them smaller. It makes the bee physically smaller, and it makes them shorter lived. And they can't, one of the things I wondered when Sammy Ramsey told us that varroa feed on the bee's fat body is I wanted to know if that was permanent. Once the bee emerged, could she somehow regain that function that the varroa took away? And the answer is no. It is a permanent effect that damages the bee. So while they can still get food from the nurse bees and survive, they will never be able to grow those big fat bodies of a healthy 5-day-old nurse bee. And having a smaller fat body and not being able to nurse the other bees causes them to mature through the stages of development faster. They process less vitellogenin, they make less wax, and they have less energy to grow into strong guard bees. And having reduced stores, vitellogenin stores, shortens their life as a forager. And it also creates a greater demand for nurse bees to provide enough food for the colony, because so many of the nurse bees have been crippled. They need more nurse bees just to feed the colony. And that reduces the number of foragers that are available to go out and bring in food. So with less food coming into the colony, it can't thrive, and oftentimes just kind of spirals down and never really does very well. So for a single bee, having a damaged fat body may not be an issue, but when it's multiplied by an entire colony, it can be both devastating and invisible to the beekeeper. So let's look at the effect on winter bees. By damaging the fat body, the varroa prevents the bee from storing enough vitellogenin to become a long-lived bees. So a larva that has had a varroa mite in its cell as it's developing can never be a winter bee. It will always be a short-lived summer bee. So while in summer this shows up as a less populated colony, in the winter it's catastrophic. The compromised bees all hit the end of that short summer lifespan by midwinter. So remember, if it's a summer bee, not a winter bee, it's only going to live for about 8 weeks. And so by the time we get to winter, that's when those colonies start collapsing. And at this point, there may not be enough bees left in the colony to generate the heat that the cluster needs. And this results in a shrinking cluster, which is evidenced by spots of unemerged brood or rings of chilled brood. And this is what Dewey Caron calls the bathtub ring. If you look at a frame and there's a circle of dead brood, what that tells you is that the colony was contracting. and it wasn't able to keep that entire surface of bees warm, so the ones on the edge died. And he calls that the bathtub ring, and it's a sign of the bees beginning to collapse. So so when the colony finally succumbs to the cold, because they get so small they can't generate enough heat, what you'll find in the spring is a bunch of bees headfirst into the comb, where they were trying really hard to generate enough heat for everybody. And those dead bees are covered by a small cluster of moldy dead bees. This is not colony loss due to humidity or starvation. It's directly related to unmanaged varroa earlier in the year and the damage that they do by feeding on the developing bee's fat body. It's the lack of having enough winter bees. So this is a little bit more complex of a graph that I like to show. I just think it's such a fantastic visual that I'm going to walk you through this so you can kind of understand how these bees travel through winter, how they survive in generations through the winter. So this right axis is a 12-day generation of bees. And the axis on the bottom is how they travel through time, through the winter. So each one of these bars is a generation of bees. And these are the same bees. So August 31st, these are the same bees, except they're on August 12th. So the blue areas, these are summer bees, all bees that live about 8 weeks. And the other colors are winter bees that are the long-lived winter bees. So you can see here on August 31st, the black sections is how much brood there is, and the brown is capped larvae. So you can see there's very little brood compared to the amount of amount of brood that's about to emerge. So these have a much higher chance of being a winter bee because they're not going to have to feed very much larvae. So this generation on August 31st becomes the yellow band on September 12th. And then on September 24th, we're starting to see just a little bit of normal attrition happening. But about a third of this yellow generation is still alive by the time we get to December. And then the same with this orange and green. Almost all of these are alive because they're nursing very, very little brood. So they have the ability to stay alive. But then if we look at this and we think about what if varroa was in this colony, they hadn't been controlled, then this yellow generation is not going to be winter bees, they're going to be summer bees because they'll have had damaged fat bodies. And so when we look by the time we get to December, that's about a third of the colony will lose, that will simply die off at this point because they have that 8-week lifespan. So it's a really significant portion of bees when you consider that they only make bees for about 4 to 5 weeks during September and a little bit of October. So it's really, really important by August 31st to have your hive completely healthy with no varroa in it. So let's look a little bit about when we would have to start our treatments. So what I'm challenging here a little bit is the idea that we need to start looking for varroa and treating our bees in August, because I think August is a little bit too late to start treating for varroa and to start watching more closely. It really needs to be done starting in the spring all the way to fall. So if one of the things you're treating with is either Apigard or the single pad of formic acid, those are 24-day treatments. That means you have to get that treatment in the hive by August 8th in order to have the treatments all done by August 31st. And if you're using something like the formic 2-pad method, which is a lot harder on the bees, but a lot faster, you could start as late as August 22nd. But to my way of thinking, the nurse bees that feed your winter bees have to be really, really healthy. So let's say on August 31st, you've completed all of your treatments, but the bees that are in the hive had still been exposed to varroa. Even though all of them are gone today, 2 or 3 weeks ago, the varroa level was really high. That means that the viral load within the colony is still really high. So what you really need to do is start getting those varroa cleared out in July, because you want the nurse bees that actually create the nurse bees that are going to be really healthy to feed your winter bees. So I always go back 2 generations or an extra start a month earlier to make sure that you've got super, super healthy nurse bees feeding those winter bees. So it's a little bit complex. I hope that made sense. But start earlier instead of later and keep them low year round. So the last slide to wrap it up. Let's summarize how to protect your bees. So there are 2 main threats to the bee's fat body: varroa mites and poor nutrition. We saw the effect of varroa, but we also want to make sure that the bees have a consistent supply of high quality pollen, either from flowers or pollen patty supplements when needed. Studies have found that if larvae are deprived of enough brood food if they don't get enough brood food for even a few hours during a really sensitive development window, I think it's on either day 2 or day 3, they emerge as much smaller bees, and their fat bodies can never become large, really similar to the effects of if they'd had varroa, but without the viruses. So having consistent, high-quality pollen is critical to colony health. It's much easier to see honey and weigh honey in a colony to know if they need to be supplemented with sugar. And when sugar is used on top of the hive in the winter, it's really easy to see if they're running low. But it's really a lot more difficult to estimate the amount of pollen that they're going to need in the winter, how much they have stored, and if they're starting to run out. Pollen supplements during a time of dearth and in winter are a really good safeguard to make sure that your bees are able to maintain large, healthy fat bodies so they can live long lives and establish large, strong colonies. So that is the presentation today. Do we have any questions?
Well, thank you so much, Dawn. Just a reminder, guys, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I don't see any here on my side, so I am going to check in with Margot, our other moderator, to see if she has any questions from her group.
Well, we have some questions. We actually, not really, one, Ken Stodden says that he's seen some beetles on the top lid of his hive today, and he wanted to know how to get rid of them. Not related to the topic, but maybe Ellen or Alan could come in and provide some assistance.
Did he say what type of beetles there are?
No.
Okay.
It's a hive beetle because the hive beetles have the little dingle balls. They're
Right.
just really distinctive little dingle balls. So if it doesn't have the dingle balls and it's not kind of roundish, then it's probably not a hive beetle. I actually, for the first time, had a few hive beetles this year. So they're kind of making their way south from Whatcom County on the coastal areas. And the things that I've been reading that folks are having some success with is those beetle blaster traps. It's just a little trap, and even in the winter, you can set it between the frames on the very top box. And people they actually put all oil in it. It calls for oil, but I've been reading that people have had really good success by putting a little bit of vinegar in the oil. So you kind of put a little salad dressing in there for them. And some people put diatomaceous earth in there, and those seem to be really pretty effective at trapping the beetles. Then you want to make sure to put those little Swiffer sheets inside on top of a couple of the frames, and the beetles can get tangled up in those. a way to prevent them from reproducing. Now they can fly a really long ways. So if there's a lot of them in the area, it's really difficult to control them within your own yard. But if it's just limited to your yard, if you put a really strong ground cloth underneath your hives, it does help reduce the number of larvae that can drop down out of the bottom of the hive, because what they do is they burrow into the ground and they pupate in the ground underneath the hive, and then they fly out and back into the hives again. Some people use things called Grubex and chemicals underneath the hive to kill the grubs under the hive. I think I'd have to be pretty desperate before I use something like that, but a ground cover under the hive does help a little bit. Does anyone else have any experience or suggestions with the hive beetles?
Yeah, I agree with you, Don. Is the blasters are probably one of the safest way to deal with the hive beetles this time of the year, because you definitely don't want to be in there that much. So you just want something that can just trap them, as they come. So I think the hive blaster is probably a good method right now.
Okay, I have one other question. Joy Stanner asked, can a hive survive winter if it has been had deformed wing disease and treated with OAV?
Oh, I think it depends on how many of the bees were affected. The deformed wing virus, those bees simply don't survive. They're just kind of, they never become foragers, and I can't imagine that they would be very effective at being winter bees. So if it's just a small proportion, then maybe they could be okay. Oftentimes the drones are disproportionately affected by deformed wing virus. So if a lot of what you saw, Joyce, is drones, you could be okay, because they might all be booted out by now. But if the viral level and the varroa level in the colony were high enough that the virus has got a little out of control like that, then it will make it more challenging for the colony to survive the winter. So I just recommend bundle them up, keep them warm, feed them lots of pollen and extra sugar to make sure that they've got the best chance of getting through the winter.
We do have a question from Beverly Phoenix. She asks, so drones don't have fat bodies? Question mark.
Oh, that's a good question. I think that they do have fat bodies, but I'm thinking that they're underdeveloped and they don't use them because they never do nursing. And as we know, the drones need to be fed all the time by the nurse bees. So I suspect that they do have fat bodies, but they're underdeveloped and not effective at actually supporting the drone.
Are there any other questions? I don't have any more from here.
All right, and it doesn't look like we've got any on our side. So thank you, Dawn, so much. There's so much information. I highly encourage anybody that's here or watching it, if you need to rewatch, rewind, just get as much of this information as you can. It's very valuable in your beekeeping practices. I do just want to remind everybody, we will not be having a December session, but we will be back in January. So happy holidays, and we will see you guys all in the new year.
Well, we
Thank you so much.
We got one question here at the end. Sorry.
Oh, one more come in? Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
That's
Barbara
all right.
McDonald asked, would feeding pollen assist a colony who suffered from inadequate varroa treatment?
I think it could help some. As we saw on the one chart, they do continue making small amounts of brood throughout the year. It certainly couldn't hurt. So if I was worried about a colony, I would give them pollen supplements. I know from Alan, I've started using the Hive Alive, which also has some probiotics in the fall, which can really help boost their health. And they really love this stuff. You put one of those Hive Alive patties on there, and they really like it. They go straight for it. So I would try some of those things. And beekeeping, every year you learn a little bit more. And when we lose our bees, it's just a gut punch. It feels awful. And the trick to being a good beekeeper is to being able to tolerate that and coming back and learning and trying again next year. So if the mite treatments, if we weren't like 100% on our mite treatments last year, next year is your chance to start in the spring. And if you simply can't bring yourself to kill 300 bees to test them, if you're using a really gentle treatment like oxalic acid sponges and vaporizing, it could be okay to even just treat without testing. I know that's a little bit of heresy in the bee world, but it's really, really important to stay on top of your varroa in the spring, especially, and then in the fall when they build up. So often we only talk about August, but I think those spring treatments are just super important.
And Barbara had a follow-up question. She wanted to know, is there a specific type of pollen? Is the Hive
Pollen,
Alive?
Hive Alive I believe it has some protein in it, some pollen. It's primarily a winter feed that has sugar and probiotics and lots of other good things in it. And it's good to give them, a dose in the fall and a dose in the spring. For pollen patties, Randy Oliver, if you go out to his website, Scientific Beekeeping, he did a study on the different pollen patties, how the bees fared eating different pollen patties, and he found that global patties, the bees did the best. And I believe global patties also have a little bit more actual pollen protein in them than the other pollen patties, which are usually mostly things like brewer's yeast and a few other non-flower pollen protein sources.
Okay, any other questions? It doesn't look like it from here. Thank you everyone for attending. Please tell your other beekeeping friends about Ask a Washington Beekeeper. You can like the page or follow it. And as Megan said, we will have our next presentation the third Thursday in January. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays.